This is an interview with Dr. Paul Seabright, an economist who studied at Oxford, earning first class honors and a doctorate in the 1980s, and who has been a professor of economics at the Toulouse School of Economics since 2000. He's the author of The Company of Strangers, exploring how humans learn to trust and cooperate beyond close circles, and The War on the Sexes, on conflict and cooperation between men and women through an economic and evolutionary lens. You can read more about Dr. Seabright on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy the interview.
To begin with your education, you studied economics at Oxford, earning first-class honors and a doctorate in the 1980s. What initially drew you to economics, and how did your first time at Oxford shape your intellectual path?
Well, I think one of the things I was very lucky about being of that generation was that we were really not very worried about getting jobs. I mean, the particular job we might get was a problem. We were intensely worried about other things. We were worried about the state of the world. This was a time at which, the Cold War was at its height. We were seriously worried about the possibility of nuclear war. We were seriously worried about the way the planet was going, although climate change was not yet then on our agenda. But we weren't worried as a generation about finding some reasonable and interesting employment. And of course, that's very different now. I think many people of your generation are intensely anxious about whether they're going to find employment in an interesting way. You're worried even more now that AI is going to take your jobs. And we were lucky in that way. And that, of course, was a tremendous privilege because it meant that we could get into studying things that were interesting and not worry about whether studying something interesting was going to rule us out of consideration in the labor market. And I think many more of your generation do face that trade-off. I mean, it's a trade-off in their heads. It's not necessarily a trade-off in the facts, but it's a trade-off in their heads. They're worried that if they spend their time doing interesting things, they're going to rule themselves out of consideration for employment. I don't think that should be the case, but I'm aware that I was from a very privileged and lucky generation for that not to be a daily anxiety.
Why do you think it is that you weren't concerned about getting a job and things like that?
Well, I think that I was a beneficiary of the first generation that benefited from the big expansion of universities. And we were, of course, I graduated in 1980, and this was just after the first oil shock and so on. But the reality hadn't really sunk in that, unemployment might be a big deal, in particular for people who were well educated. Unemployment was a really big deal for people in declining industries, people who had low levels of education and so on. But we were not at that point really starting to think that it was coming for us. I mean, don't forget that we'd had 30 years of full employment growth after the Second World War. We'd had this big expansion of universities. The expansion had meant that really people who were motivated, who were reasonably smart, could get into universities. They could do really interesting subjects. They could do art subjects, they could do science subjects, they could do social science. And there was a real feeling that, if you were motivated and smart, the world would have a slot for you to pursue that kind of activity. As I say, we were intentionally anxious about other stuff, about whether the world was in deep trouble militarily, politically, geostrategically. But the fear that the world might be doing okay, but it wouldn't have a slot for us to do interesting work wasn't really a big deal. And of course, that's changed because we've now had unemployment of one kind or another since that glorious period of 30 years after the Second World War. There have been ups and downs, there have been financial crises, there have been big technological changes, there's been the China shock, there's been sort of IT getting rid of certain kinds of jobs. There's now AI. All of these things add up to, I think, a sort of multi-directional shock that many people are afraid that the sort of thing their parents were able to do is not something they're able to do. And particularly if you work now in, let's say, the world of ideas, you used to be able to say, well, okay, my dad worked in a factory and his job in the factory no longer exists, but I will surely be able, I work in ideas and my job in ideas will surely exist. And I think now that old certainty is disappearing. I'm not sure that everybody has to be as worried as they are, but I think a lot of people are worried.
Your career took you from Cambridge to Toulouse, where you've been a professor of economics since 2000. What motivated you to what motivated your move to Toulouse, to the Toulouse School of Economics? And how did working in France influence your perspective on research compared to your time in the UK?
Oh, that's quite complicated because France has a great engineering tradition. I would say probably greater than the engineering tradition in the UK. And a lot of people in France, a lot of my colleagues in France, are both superbly trained engineers and also tend to think like engineers in the sense that somebody else gives them the problem to solve and they solve it. They're not as naturally trained in thinking about what might be cool problems. It's pretty clear if you're trained as an engineer, to put it crudely, if you have to figure out how to get a bridge to stay up, or if you have to work out how to take a rocket to Mars, then you kind of know what the outcome is. Other people tell you what's important about the outcome, and then you really have to figure out inventive and ingenious and reliable ways to get there. Um, my education in the UK, and particularly in Oxford, was very lucky because I suppose you could say we were a relatively poorly technically trained group of people. I mean, I have math skills, for example, that are much less good than those of most of my colleagues in the same profession in France. But at the same time, we were really trained in thinking about what would be fun questions to try and answer. And so I think my colleagues in Toulouse are quite indulgent to me because they realize that I'm not as technically skilled as they are in answering the questions, but I come up all the time with interesting new questions for them to think about. And so I think we have a kind of good working relationship in that way. So France, as I say, has this great engineering tradition. And of course, that's now quite challenged because a lot of engineering skills are ones that can be replicated by computing methods. Um, it's also true that answering interesting questions can send you down rabbit holes. And of course, the tradition of people educated in the kind of Oxford system where you learn many disciplines. I mean, I studied as an undergraduate a degree called philosophy, politics, and economics, and I didn't make up my mind which of those I was going to follow until very late in the day. So I did a bit of philosophy, I did a bit of political science, I did a bit of economics, and um, it meant that at any one point we could leave off answering a question before we'd fully answered it and start answering another one, which is a very infuriating habit to many people. And I think many people find um, that I have a kind of low threshold of concentration because I'm always interested in new questions, whereas for a lot of them, you really shouldn't start thinking about a new question until you really comprehensively and absolutely convincingly answered the old one. But coming to France was a great kind of corrective to my gadfly tendencies and helped me to settle down and devote myself to answering questions with a little bit more persistence and a little bit more rigor.
You served as director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Toulouse from 2012 to 2021, an institute known for bridging economics with other disciplines. What inspired you to take on this role, and how did that experience shape your views on the value and challenges of interdisciplinary research?
Well, I think, first of all, I got the job by a sort of accident because we got this grant from the French government. Somebody had to run the place, and basically, I was the last man standing. So I didn't particularly seek it. I'm very, very glad I did it. It was a fantastic job, but I didn't look for it. I was sort of parachuted into it unexpectedly. But I ended up doing it for 9 years and loved it. Although, to be honest, I'd never actually managed anything more ambitious than a family picnic before then. So I had zero management training. But what was exciting about it was trying to think about a unifying vision for social sciences. And perhaps one way to explain it to you is that when you start studying economics, you're told we're going to assume that people are basically self-interested and motivated by material rewards. We know that's not true in life, but we also think it's a very useful simplification that can get us a long way. And so you get the famous Homo economicus, which is the workhorse of many economic models. Now, the thing is that many people will start by thinking, yes, that's a useful simplification, and they forget that it's a simplification, and then they treat it as though it's essentially the only important reality. The weird thing, and this was where my training in multiple disciplines helped, was that I was aware at the time that in political science, people are taught something else. They're told people are interested in political power. So when we study, electoral systems, we assume everybody wants to be elected, and that's the main thing motivating them. And of course, we realize that life isn't quite as simplistic as that, but it's a useful simplification, and we'll keep going. So in political science, they do the same thing, which is they take a useful simplification, they build all their models around it, and then they forget that it's a simplification. They carry on like that. And it's kind of similar in sociology, where people treat norms and institutions as sort of they assume that people abide by various kinds of social norms, or maybe that they belong to certain social classes, or it depends on the flavor of sociology you're talking about. But they start with this as a use of simplification, then they forget it's a simplification. And so, what I found when I was setting up this institution, when we were setting up the institution, was that we wanted to think hard about the fundamentals of what motivates human beings and how do they live without committing ourselves to one of those particular simplifications. We wanted to say, what's the kind of research you would do if you were trying to figure out what motivates human beings and what are the contexts under which, for example, they are particularly motivated by material rewards versus the kinds of settings under which they're motivated by political power. And so um, that made it very natural, for example, to bring anthropology on board, because anthropology really is the subject which studies how human communities evolve over time and how they develop and the many different things that people within them do, how they interact with each other, and so on. And so, what was fun was to have an institutional setting in which we would have seminars, for example, and the people who were studying political science would have to come and listen to the economists or the sociologists. The people who were studying um, uh, history, economic history, would have to listen to the political scientists and so on. I mean, I still remember the first day we had a seminar by a primatologist who was studying conflict among baboons. And I had various political scientists saying to me, do we have to come to that seminar? It's really very far away from what we're doing. So I said, look, just wait, trust me, you'll enjoy it. And so they came. And when this wonderful primatologist was talking about conflicts in baboons, they very quickly realized it was very like trying to understand why, Republicans and Democrats can't get along together in the United States. And that actually there are all sorts of interesting parallels between coalition building and conflict in baboon societies and coalition building and conflict in the US Congress or in, other kinds of human societies. And that was, I mean, I was lucky that the particular primatologist talking that day and the particular subject that she was talking about was so obviously relevant to political science. But what it meant was that it got me some credit. And when subsequently I was, people would say to me, "Oh, come on, I'm a sociologist. Why do I have to go and listen to an evolutionary biologist? Or I'm a biologist. Why do I have to go and listen to an economic historian?" I would be able to say, trust me, I think you will find not necessarily that every seminar by somebody out of your discipline is going to be interesting, but that over time, as you go to enough of them, you'll start to see the parallels and the analogies with stuff that you care about. And I still remember talking to one of my colleagues Mohammed Saleh, who's now at the London School of Economics, very fine economic historian, who it was about 3 years after he'd arrived. And I said, well, now you've been here 3 years, what have been the big surprises? And he said, the big surprise was that when I arrived, you told me that in exchange for some benefits, I was going to have to attend seminars out of my discipline, and I thought of this as a cost. He says now, 3 years later, I think of this not as a cost, but an even extra benefit because I've learned so much from these seminars outside my discipline that I never would have learned if I had stayed in an economic history department.
In 2004, you published The Company of Strangers, A Natural History of Economic Life, where you examine how humans learn to trust and cooperate beyond their immediate social circles. What led you to explore the evolutionary origins of economic cooperation in the book, and what key messages about trust in economic life did you hope to convey?
Well, the funny thing was that writing that book was really mostly, I think, for my kids because my kids were in a school system in France where you either choose to go into a track that's science-based, or you go into a track that's literature-based, or there's a third track which is sort of economics and sociology-based. And they were aware that many of their friends who were studying the economics track were bored rigid by it and were only doing it because their parents told them that it was going to be good to help them get a job. And my kids, with whom I have lots of interesting discussions about many things that interest us, were aware that I taught economics, but found it a bit weird that I should be teaching this subject that all of their friends were telling them was absolutely the most boring subject in the school. And so they couldn't quite get it. And so I really set out originally to write it to explain to them why economics was exciting. And at the time, we used to watch a lot of those nature things, the kind of things you see on the Discovery Channel with people like David Attenborough. And the great thing that David Attenborough would do is, you'd have the shot panning over a piece of jungle in, I don't know, Indonesia or somewhere, and he would come to an ant hill and he would say, look, if you open this ant hill, you will see all these ants rushing around, and it's completely mysterious why they're doing what they're doing. But let me tell you, this is why it's happening. And so I had this sort of almost a vision of a big David Attenborough type coming to a city like Toulouse, where I was living, and say, okay, you can kick away the top of the anthill and you see all these people rushing around in Toulouse, and it's completely mysterious why they're doing what they're doing. But let me tell you, it's got some logic to it. And in particular, at the time, I'd been reading a lot of historical anthropology about the levels of violence in prehistoric societies. And I was thinking to myself, if I had been a member of a hunter-gatherer band 20,000 years ago, and I had gone out of my group and I'd seen a group of strangers some distance away, and I'd walked up to them and said, could I have a cup of coffee and a croissant, please, or whatever the prehistoric equivalent was. I wouldn't have got away with my life. They'd have clubbed me to death and stolen anything that I happened to have with me. And I was just thinking about how strange it is that, we can all go out every day into a city full of millions of strangers, and we just walk up to somebody you've never seen before and say, can I have a cup of coffee, please? And they say, sure. And that's something that we've gotten so used to that we take it completely for granted. And I was thinking, no, we shouldn't take it for granted. Just like David Attenborough said, you see all these ants beneath your feet as you're walking along, and you don't think twice about why the ants are doing what they're doing. Well, I thought we should turn that gaze on ourselves and think, what is it about ourselves that's so strange? And this fact that we can go and ask for a cup of coffee from a complete stranger and not be clubbed to death is just one of the amazing things. And of course, it's fragile. I mean, you see, I was just reading, Russia launched some drones and missiles on Kiev this morning, and 4 people dead, 30 people injured. I mean, these are people who were going about their ordinary business like they'd come to expect they could, and now suddenly is somebody is launching these murderous missiles at them. What's going on? And I think the fact that we've gotten so used to taking it for granted means we need to look at it really hard and think, how justified are we for taking it for granted? How did it come to be that way? And how robust is it um, against challenges from, people like Putin?
The second edition of The Company of Strangers included analysis of how the rise and fall of social trusts contributed to the global economic boom and the 2008 financial crisis. How did the events of the financial crisis influence your thinking on trust and economic stability?
Well, I think it was a similar kind of thing that in a world in which financial institutions are functioning really well, you think, well, I can deposit my savings in a bank or I can go and ask for a loan. And, there's a certain amount of procedures to go through. But basically, when I put my money in a bank, I don't doubt that I can go and take it out the next day. And that's the whole point about savings. In most reasonably prosperous countries, we don't put our savings in gold under the mattress. Even though in the countries where people do that, it's usually dangerous because if you've got your savings in gold under the mattress, then that gives a lot of other people an incentive to break into your house and steal it. But we don't do that because we just assume that it's perfectly safe if you put it in a bank. And of course, as people discovered in various crises in history, it isn't always safe if you put it in a bank, particularly if the bank is lending it out on speculative ventures. And you normally can go and get your savings out because somebody, even though your savings have been now lent to somebody else has been depositing their savings, and the bank basically allows you to withdraw what you think of as your savings because it's somebody else's money, not the money that you lent them. So all of that, the idea that there's this calm, reliable structure of financial institutions, which we take for granted, can suddenly come unstuck. And sure enough, in the 2008 financial crisis, it did. And it did not so much, and this was a very important point that I made in the book, not so much because the systems were functioning badly, but precisely because they were functioning well. They were functioning so well that people stopped asking themselves some basic questions about, are the banks putting money into unreasonably speculative activities, which many of them were. And the point is that it's precisely because the system functions extremely well that you don't ask yourself questions. So just imagine, say, making a trip to the Grand Canyon and looking out over some of the, beautiful scenery from a very high point up, and there's a rail there, and you don't think twice because the rail is extremely reliable. Well, if you are prepared to sort of horse about and push yourself against the rail without checking it, then one of these days the rail is going to be unreliable and somebody was going to go over the top. I actually broke a rib many years ago in Venezuela in exactly such a situation. Fortunately, not a big drop, just a small drop, because of a rail that I just kind of assumed, well, if the rail is there, it works. And it turned out it didn't work. And when I put my weight against it, I fell right off a bridge as it happened and broke a rib in the river underneath it. Not a big drop, luckily. Otherwise, I wouldn't be around to tell the tale. But so it's like if you're surrounded by infrastructure which normally works really well, you stop testing it. And so when you stop testing it, then one day it isn't going to work so well. And that's essentially what happened. So and it's an important thing to notice. Some people, when they write about the institutions of capitalism, will tell you, oh my God, these are a disaster, they are constantly failing, and so on. I think it's not so interesting to write about the failure of the institutions of capitalism if you think they're always a disaster. What's really interesting is to understand why they fail in spite of the fact that they often work so well. It's because when they work pretty well most of the time that people stop checking them, people stop verifying that they are actually trustworthy. And so it's when everybody's gotten used to trusting the institutions for many years that they're at their most dangerous because then nobody's thinking to check them anymore.
Your book, The War on the Sexes, explores how conflict and cooperation between men and women have been shaped by our evolutionary history. What prompted you to investigate gender dynamics through an economic and evolutionary lens? And what are your key insights about how our ancestral past influences modern relationships between the sexes in both the home and workplace?
Okay, that's a huge question. Let me Start it with a little anecdote. When The Company of Strangers was published, that you've kindly referred to, a friend of mine called Giuseppe Bertola, who's a labor economist, read it and said, Paul, I quite like your book, but I didn't like it as much as I expected to. And in particular, I felt that you were talking about cooperation between people who are rather abstract, and they lack, in some sense, real flesh and blood. Um, and the particular two ways in which they lack flesh and blood is, one is that they're not gendered, so they're not male or female, they're just reasonable, abstract people who are thinking about how to cooperate. And the second thing is that they don't really have any ideology, they don't have any beliefs, they don't have any religion. And so they don't have many of the kind of heady things that make people passionate about ideas, about is there a life beyond the world, and so on. And he said, I think that if you're going to really understand human society, you need those two dimensions. So I said, Giuseppe, you're so right. The Company of Strangers doesn't deal with either of those things. And although I didn't uh, make a promise to this, as it turned out, I spent the next 20 years of my career studying those two dimensions that I had left out of the Company of Strangers. First dimension was gender, and the second dimension was basically religion. And so one of the things I wanted to figure out was why is gender such an important part of modern society? It's important not just because, as clearly people worry about, there are many kinds of discrimination and in particular, men continue to hold power over many things, over the allocation of resources, over the allocation of privilege in many ways in many societies. But it's also because what it reminds us is that um, human society is full of coalitions that have to work together if we're to accomplish anything. And, sexual reproduction is the absolutely classic basic example of this, because unless you get a male and a female collaborating enough to produce a fertilized ovum, a uh, you don't get a person at all. And secondly, in the human species, a fertilized ovum will never survive on its own. Unlike in fish, for example, where fertilized ova are just released into the sea and some of them survive. But a human fertilized ovum will never survive on its own. It has to be brought up by a very complex coalition of of adults who include its biological parents, but not only its biological parents. I was very aware of this in August when my 13-month-old grandson came to stay with me. And at one point, we had various aunts and uncles and people. And I still remember an evening where there were 12 of us at the dinner table. And this kid of 13 months was just basically running the show. He was ordering all of these 12 adults around to look after him, give him attention, and so on. And I was just thinking, the human species is pretty unusual because a child who is barely able to move around by himself, he was just learning to walk, is nevertheless able to control with an iron will the the things that you know uh, 12 adults are doing. He dominates the attention, and that's really something very unique about human society. So I um, approached the question of relations between men and women as part of the bigger question of why does it take huge teams of adults to raise our kids, and how do those adults work together? So gender is part of a wider story about human collaboration, and that's what, in a sense, unites it with the Company of Strangers. Then, of course, there's lots of specific questions about discrimination on the basis of gender, or issues about, whether labor markets or political systems are particularly tend to discriminate against women and so on, which I do go into the book. But I wanted to, those questions seem to me were downstream of a broader question of how to understand the fact that family life, and particularly the raising of kids, is just this massively cooperative activity in humans, which it isn't in any other animal that we really know of.
Lastly, we ask all of our interviewees the same question, which is how do you define success both personally and professionally?
Oh goodness. I mean, I think uh, I've just been lucky to have a lot of fun in my life, and fun for me has obviously included being able to think about and talk about and research and write about all sorts of ideas that are ideas about where we come from as a species, how we organize ourselves, and where we're going. And I just think I've been hugely lucky to be able to every day to do a job that I love, and in particular to work with really smart and motivated and dynamic people. A lot of the my contemporaries in college um, went on to be much more successful than me in a certainly in an obvious sense. They earn far more money. They live in bigger houses. They're more successful by material criteria, which is fine because I'm that's not so important to me. But one of the things I notice is that many of them get rather isolated from young, energetic people to work with. That's to say, they tend to work with people of their own age. So by the time they're my age, which is 67 now, they're mostly working with people in their 50s and 60s. I'm incredibly lucky because yes, I work with a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, but I also work with a lot of people in their um, teens, 20s, and 30s who are full of energy, full of dynamism, ideas, creativity, and so on. And so I think that I'm lucky to work in one of those areas where I'm constantly meeting new people. I'm constantly meeting dynamic young people with ideas, with energy. And it makes me, I think, a lot more optimistic than I would otherwise be about the future and about the fact that going on doing work like this is going to be exciting for many people, including people of your age. And I hope that by the time you get to my age, you'll feel equally that you've had a fun time and that you have things to do with the people who will then be in their teens and 20s and whom you can look at with the same degree of and interact with the same degree of pleasure that I do.